And I just need to address the ending right off the bat because I was shocked by this ending. Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura. And this is my dog Cookie, and I have her here with me today because we are talking about Pet Sematary by Stephen King, published in 1983. And I will be talking about both of the movies, the one from 1989, directed by Mary Lampert, as well as the 2019 movie directed by Kevin Klosh and Dennis Widmeyer. But I will not have Cookie throughout the whole video. Just wanted her to make an appearance since it is fitting, and it's been a while since I've had her in a video. But yeah, this is our 7-year-old dog, Cookie. And Pet Sematary was a subscriber request, which I have been doing a lot of lately, but it also won a book versus movie poll that I posted. So if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, be sure and do that. That way you can participate in future book versus movie content. And for the majority of this video, I will be focusing on the book and the 1989 movie. Like when I'm talking about the plot, those are the two I will be talking about. However, I will have a section at the end where I share my thoughts on the 2019 movie. And as always, this is broken up into timestamps, so you can jump around to whatever part you want. But from here on out, I will be getting into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. And again, specifically the 1989 movie, this was adapted by Stephen King, and he even has a cameo in this movie. And this is the first Stephen King adaptation I have covered that he cameos in, as far as I can recall. And so that was fun. But also because he wrote the script, I assumed it would be very faithful to the book, and it was. But to go over the basic gist for the plot for those who do not know, so we have Louis, his wife Rachel, and their two kids, Ellie, who is about 5, and their son Gage, who is 2 years old. And they have recently moved into a house in, you guessed it, a small town in Maine. And they have a cat named Church, and their house is by a road that has these huge semi-trucks that will frequently drive by. And a few months in, Church is hit by one of these semis and dies. And Jud is their elderly neighbor who Louis has grown very close to. And the family is gone when Church dies. And so Jud tells Louis, he's like, you know what? I can help you out. And so he had shown them the pet cemetery past their house when they first moved in, but he takes Louis beyond the pet cemetery because when you go past it further up into the hills, the mountains, you reach an old Micmac Native American burial ground, and he tells him to bury Church here. And then what do you know, the next day, who comes lurching back into the house but Church? So it turns out this burial ground brings things back to life. And so while Church is different, for the most part, his family is none the wiser, and Ellie has no idea that her cat had died. And then this happens in November, and then when we are in like late spring, Gage, their 2-year-old, he is also hit by a semi and he also dies. And so they bury him in a regular cemetery, and about like 4 or 5 days after his death, Louis decides that he is going to dig up Gage and rebury him in the burial grounds. And so he sends his family away so that he can do this. And while they are in a different state, Ellie, she starts having these dreams because it seems like Ellie might have a bit of the shine, but then on top of that, there's also this friendly ghost that is trying to warn her that something is going on. And so Ellie is having these dreams about something bad happening with her dad and Gage. And so she tells this to her mom, Rachel, and Rachel is worried enough about this that she decides to head back home. And she calls Jud, telling him like, you know, something's wrong, like, can you keep an eye out on Louis? And so Rachel heads home and she knows something is wrong, but she has no idea exactly what is wrong. Jud, however, he does know what is wrong. He knows what is on Louis's mind, and he had even tried to talk him out of it like the previous day, but he knows what Louis is up to. So he sets up shop in front of his house to watch when Louis comes home so that he can stop him from taking Gage up to the burial grounds. However, he falls asleep and he isn't able to prevent it from happening. And so Louis buries Gage, and then Gage returns. However, now he is evil and he ends up killing Jud. And then Rachel comes back in the wee hours of the morning, and then Gage kills Rachel as well. And then when Louis wakes up at like a regular point in the morning, he goes over to the house and Church is there, and he first kills Church, then he kills Gage, and then he takes his wife's body out of the house, and he then burns the house with Gage's body and Jud's body inside, and then he takes his wife's body up to the burial grounds to bury her too. And in both book and movie, we end seeing the undead Rachel returning to be with Louis. And I just need to address the ending right off the bat because I was shocked by this ending when I read the book. This is not the type of ending I expect from Stephen King, and I have read like a fair amount of his books at this point. And generally speaking, the good guy wins messed up stuff happens along the way, but when all is said and done, we have more of an uplifting, happy ending. And so while I was reading, when he finds Rachel's dead body, my first thought was like, ooh, like, I hope he buries it in the burial ground too. But then right after thinking that, I was like, no, though. This is Stephen King. He's not going to do that. And I was already shocked enough that Gage kills Rachel. I did not expect that. Like, that was already pushing it further than I would have expected. But then King pushes it even further, and he has Louis, not learn his lesson, and he has just gone insane at this point. And then he buries Rachel too, right after. But yeah, it was just such a twisted, sad ending. And I thought it was perfect. I loved this ending. And yeah, I had not expected it, but I thought it was a great way to end the book. And in the movie, we have the same ending, of course. But in the movie, we see Rachel return from the dead, and then he and Rachel kiss, which was gross. But then while they're kissing, Rachel picks up a knife, we cut to black, and then we hear Louis screaming. And that was not the case in the book. In the book, Rachel just returns and is like, hello, darling. And then the book ends like that. And grief is a huge theme in this book. And the movie touches on this as well. But the book just really shows how the burial ground feeds on grief and it gains strength from it. And we also see how it lures people in, and it's like a drug. And once someone has been there once, they will find a reason to tell someone else about it so that they can return to it, because again, it's like this drug that is pulling them in. But also they have this desire to pass the secret on to someone else before they die, right? Which is what Jud did. And so because of this, the curse just continues on generation after generation, and there is no end to it, seemingly. And this is kind of like grief, right? Because there is no way that we can just conquer grief as a whole and no one has to deal with it anymore. Like, we all still have to deal with grief at different points in our life, just like this town still has to deal with this curse of this burial ground. And in the book, the morning after he buries Gage there, he has a moment of clarity where he's like, how could I have been so stupid? Because at this point, he hasn't seen Rachel's dead body, but it's pretty clear that Rachel is dead. And so he's like, how could I have been so stupid as to do this? And then in the book we read, grief, not stupidity, Louis. There is a difference, small but vital. The battery that burying ground survives on. Growing in power, Jud said. And of course he was right, and you're part of its power now. It has fed on your grief. No, more than that. It's doubled it, cubed it, raised it to the nth power. And it isn't just grief it feeds on. Sanity. It's eaten your sanity. The flaw is only the inability to accept. Not uncommon. It's cost you your wife. It's almost surely cost you your best friend as well as your son. This is it. What comes when you're too slow wishing away the thing that knocks on your door in the middle of the night is simple enough. Total darkness. And in the book, before he sends Rachel and Ellie away, he asks Rachel, like, would you still have loved Gage even if he'd had a mental handicap? And she's like, yeah, of course I would have loved him. And he takes this as a sign that it's okay for him to bury Gage, because if he comes back from the dead and if he's kind of off, he's like, Rachel will still love him, so it's okay. So he is literally comparing a mental handicap to being a zombie, which not the same thing, right? But this just further shows how he is not thinking clearly, and he's just grasping for any way that he can justify what he is about to do. And yet at the same time, he also doesn't want to have to do it. And the night of, he keeps hoping something will prevent him from doing it, and yet he does it anyway. And also in the book, we hear how down the road, potentially another family might buy this house despite its history, and they just might have a dog, obviously implying that new families will have pets that will die in the road, and they'll be taken to the pet cemetery, or they'll be taken, to the burying grounds beyond the pet cemetery, showing again how this curse is just going to continue on forever. And the book also just really shows how Louis and Rachel are both just very consumed with their grief. In the book, Rachel, she forgets what year it is at times, and she's just so out of it, and she doesn't take care of herself, let alone Ellie, and so she's just kind of a mess oftentimes after Gage's death. And then there's a point, and we kind of see this in the movie too, where Rachel is grieving and crying, and yet Louis, who is right beside her, he doesn't have it in him to comfort her because he is so consumed with his own grief, right, that he can't even comfort his wife. And we kind of see this in the movie, but in the book, I really liked it because they're sitting in a diner and he's right beside Rachel, and yet someone else comforts Rachel instead. And the other people there are kind of like, are you serious, Louis? You're not even going to comfort your own wife? And then we have a scene in the book where Jud is talking to Ellie, and he's trying to help Ellie feel better. And after he talks to her, he looks at Rachel and Louis and he glares at them. And the message he's trying to convey with this glare is that, you are neglecting your daughter. Yes, you lost lost Gage and that's horrible, but you still have a daughter and you need to care for her right now. And in the movie, we do get this too, but it is explicitly said. He is talking to Louis and he straight up tells Louis, like, you may have lost Gage, but you still need to care for her. And yeah, the book and movie, you know, it's a sad, depressing look at grief at its worst when it just overpowers someone and they succumb to it. And there's an interesting part at the end of the book when one of Louis's friends, the morning Rachel has returned and all of this has happened, he goes over to check on Louis and he sees Louis walking up the hill towards the pet cemetery in the distance. And he is carrying something white, right? Because he has his wife wrapped up in a sheet. And so he follows after Louis and he calls out to him. And Louis, his hair has gone totally white, his face has aged, and this guy can tell that he is crazy. And he is telling this guy, like, oh, I'm gonna go bury my wife and it'll work this time, it'll be okay. Gage turned out bad because I waited too long, but Rachel, she's only been dead a few hours, so this will go better this time. And the guy, clearly he can see that something horribly wrong is happening with Louis in this situation. And yet again, the burial grounds have this pull on people. And so he is following Louis even though he feels like he shouldn't, and he's like feeling drawn to the burial ground. However, at a certain point, he is able to gain control over himself enough that he turns around and he runs away and he never returns to the town again. And I thought this was interesting because it kind of reminded me of in The Shining when Dick Hallorann is tempted to go down the same path Jack did. However, ultimately, he is able to overpower the temptation of the Overlook. And so this was like that, right? However, I will say that in Pet Sematary, the guy who is following Louis, he has not experienced the same level of grief that Louis had, so there is that, but I still thought it was a good scene. In the movie, we don't have this guy, but we do have Victor Pascow, who I will get to. He is there when Louis is taking Rachel's body away, and Victor is the one that Louis is talking to, being like, oh, I still have time for Rachel. But yeah, so we see that some people can resist the pull of the burial grounds. And that brings me to Louis and Jud, right? Because they weren't able to resist it. And Jud, he is the one who passes on the secret, right? Like he knows the dangers of the burial ground, and yet he still tells Louis about it with church, right? And he lies to himself, being like, oh, I just wanted to help you. But ultimately, he later confesses that he knows he was just looking for an excuse to tell someone else about it. And he was looking for an excuse to return to it. And so really, he is as much to blame for what happens to Gage and Rachel as Louis is. And Jud himself admits as much. And yeah, Jud and Louis, they're seen as the good guys, right? And in the book, we see this in the movie, but the book really highlights this bond they have. And it's almost like this father-son connection. However, as the story goes on, we see how dangerous they both are. And I'm not saying that they are evil people, but there is something within them, like some kind of weakness or some kind of darkness that makes them susceptible to the pull of the burial ground. And it's interesting because Victor Pascow is a good angel who is trying to help, and yet he looks so freaky and disturbing, whereas Jud, he's just this innocent old man, and yet Jud is the one who can't be trusted, even though he looks trustworthy, and then Victor Pascow, who looks creepy, is the one that they should be listening to, you know? But it just goes to show that danger doesn't always come from the places you expect. And in the movie, they do foreshadow the darkness within Jud, because when Church is found dead, they have him like shrouded in this hood he is wearing. And in both book and movie, after Gage dies, Jud knows what Louis is thinking, right? He knows he's thinking of that burial ground. And so he talks to him beforehand, trying to talk him out of it. And he tells him, because before he lied, and he was like, no one has ever buried a person there. But then at this point, he's like, you know what? I lied. The truth is someone has buried a person there. And so he tells him how after World War II, there was this guy named Tim who died in the war, and he was all his father had. And so when his body is returned home, the father buries him in the Micmac burial ground. And when Tim returns, of course, the townspeople are freaked out. And so in the movie, Jud and other men from town go to this house and they burn it down with the man and the son inside. Whereas in the book, Jud and other men, they go to confront Tim and his father. However, Tim is not himself anymore. He has become something evil, and he has these weird powers where he knows someone's dirty secret. And so he tells each of these men like the secrets that they're hiding and these things that they're ashamed of having done. And the men are so freaked out that they run away. And then it is later that the house burns down and they find out that the father had killed Tim and then burned the house down with himself inside. And then when Gage comes back from the dead in the book, he has the same ability where he knows what will freak people out the most. He knows their secrets that they're keeping, you know? And when Jud had told Louis about Tim, you know, he says that the things Tim said, like they were true of each of these men. They did have these dark secrets. But then he goes on to say, but there was good in those men too. That's what I mean. That's that's what folks always find it hard to remember. It was only the bad it wanted to talk about. It was only the bad it wanted us to remember because it was bad and because it knew we meant danger for it. And this line made me think of East of Eden because there's a part when Kate is talking to Adam and Kate is talking about how like men who act nice and good, how it's all a facade because she knows their dark secrets. But Adam is like, just because people make bad choices sometimes and just because they have weaknesses, it doesn't mean that the good they do is false. It doesn't cancel out the good and mean that they're being hypocrites. It just means that they're human beings who have done bad things, but maybe they're trying to be better, and how just the full scope of a human, right? But when people are evil, they want to focus on the evil and make it seem like the good doesn't count anymore. And that's a great part in East of Eden, and I thought it was a great part here. And in the movie, I didn't think that Tim or Gage looked as creepy and disturbing and unsettling as they had in the book. And this part of them knowing people's secrets and knowing what to say to people that will freak them out the most, I really missed that here. And granted, that would be kind of hard to do with Gage because he's played by a 2-year-old boy. But I will say, to jump ahead to the 2019 movie, they do have this where when the child comes back from the dead, they know people's secrets and they speak as if they are someone else. Because in both book and 2019 movie, the child who comes back from the dead talks to Jud as if they are Norma, his dead wife. And then they say horrible things in the voice of Norma. And the movie accomplishes this by having the child transform into Norma. And so that is how the movie is able to show that. And I thought that was a really smart move. And so the older movie could have done that as well, where Gage transforms into someone else. That way we could get those creepy, eerie scenes when they're saying these horrible things. But yeah, they didn't do that. And I will say too, Gage, when he returns from the dead, we see him grimacing, trying to look threatening, but he just looks like a cute little 2-year-old who is trying to be threatening, but clearly isn't. And then there's another point when he is dressed in the same outfit we see Zelda wearing in this like old painting of Zelda as a child. And that too, it wasn't creepy. It was just kind of cute. So I will say that they didn't do the best job, again, at making Tim wasn't as creepy as he was in the book. Gage, definitely not as creepy as he was in the book. And then also Church, like in the book, like he lurches and he moves in this weird way. And the movie did not convey that. In the movie, he just has eyes that glow more than normal. And he's meaner too, which we get in the book too, where he kills animals more often. But yeah, anyway, none of them were portrayed as disturbingly as they are described in the book. But also in the book, we hear about a wendigo that is in the Micmac burying grounds. And so the Micmac tribe, like they sometimes would resort to cannibalism. And when that happened, they would blame it on the wendigo. And that's also why they left this area, was because the burial grounds were cursed from this wendigo. And in both book and movie, we do see that when people return from the dead, they do seem to have a taste for the flesh. And we have a scene where Gage bites into Jud. So the movie keeps that part, but we don't have the wendigo at all in the 1989 movie. And in the book, Louis does see the wendigo. So it was a bigger thing in the book. But to touch on Zelda, so Zelda is Rachel's dead sister. She died of spinal meningitis. And I don't know how long she was like this, but near the end of her life, she was just really weird and creepy looking and she had gone insane. And so Rachel, she was very young. She was like 8 years old and she was home alone when Zelda died. And it just becomes this traumatic event in her life. And she also felt conflicted because she wanted Zelda to die because she was scared of her and she resented her and she hated having to take care of her. And so after Zelda's death, she from then on is just really weird about death and funerals and doesn't want to talk about it and won't go to funerals until Gage dies. She does go to that funeral. And yeah, the stuff with Zelda was just so creepy. And I thought the movie did a really good job at capturing this side of the story. And it's interesting too, as far as the grief theme goes, because Rachel, I'm sure she grieves Zelda for who she was before she got sick, but then she's left with the memories of Zelda, like the image of her in her final days. And again, how she had gone crazy and she became a really disturbing person who also looked disturbing. And so yeah, just all of these conflicted emotions Rachel has towards Zelda and towards death and grief. But then I also want to talk about Norma, who I kind of mentioned. That was Jud's wife, and she is not in the movie at all. Whereas in the book, she is alive and she has a heart attack in October and Louis saves her. And it is because he saves Norma that Jud feels he owes Louis a favor. And so that is the excuse he uses to take Louis to the burial ground. However, ultimately Norma does die that January. And in the movie, we don't have Norma, like I said, but there is a housekeeper who works for Louis and Rachel, and she ends up committing suicide. And so we do have different deaths happen in both book and movie, even if they're different, but it's just these bad events that are happening leading up to Gage. And all of these events, it's just feeding the burial ground, right? Because it is feeding on the grief that people feel. So it's just gaining strength. And then to talk about Victor Pascow, speaking of people who died. So on Louis's first day of work, he is a doctor on a college campus. A young man named Victor Pascow is brought in and he dies on the spot. But right before he dies, he is alone with Louis and he tells him, at this point, Louis has seen the pet cemetery because Jud took them up there to see it. But Victor tells him, like, that's not the real pet cemetery. The real cemetery is beyond the pet cemetery. And he also calls Louis by name. And so Louis is very freaked out by this. And then later that night, Victor Pascow's ghost shows up and he takes Louis to the pet cemetery. And there is this barrier surrounding the cemetery. And he tells him, there will come a time when you want to pass this barrier, but you need to resist. Do not do that. And then Victor Pascow is the one who goes into Ellie's dreams and he warns her. And in the movie, we see him guiding Rachel throughout her time as she travels back home. And yeah, I just loved those parts in the movie as he is following Rachel and trying to help her. And he is trying the best he can to help this family, but ultimately it is to no avail. And then to talk about the 2019 movie. So this one has a lot of changes that were made from the book. And just to list off a few. So Ellie is the one who becomes close to Jud, like I said in the book and the 89 movie. Louis and Jud become really close. However, in this version, it is Ellie and Jud who become friends. And also the whole family is home when Church dies. And so Louis tells Rachel that Church is dead and he is going to go bury him in the pet cemetery. And so Rachel is just as surprised when Church returns. But then also in this version, Jud takes him to the regular pet cemetery. However, being in that pet cemetery, he feels the pull of the burial grounds. So then he's like, wait a minute, actually stop what you're doing. We're going to go even further. And he takes him to the Micmac burial grounds. And I did think this was a nice touch. And then in this movie, it is Ellie. She is the one who is hit by a semi and dies. She is the one that Louis brings back from the dead. And initially when she returns, all is well, albeit it's unsettling, but it's peaceful. But of course, ultimately she does end up killing Jud. And then Rachel returns and Louis greets Rachel and she sees Ellie and she sees what Louis has done and she is horrified. And she tries to escape and ultimately she is able to save Gage, but then Ellie kills Rachel. And then as she is dying, Louis comes over to her and she tells him, like, do not bury me in the same place you buried Ellie. And then she dies, and then Ellie knocks out Louis, and then Ellie is the one who buries Rachel in the burying ground. And so she takes Rachel to this burial ground, and Louis had followed them. And so he finds Ellie after she has buried Rachel, and he tries to kill her. But then Rachel rises from the dead, and she kills Louis. And then Rachel and Ellie take Louis's body and bury him. And then the three of them and Church walk back to the house and we see Gage sitting in the car and we can assume that they are going to kill Gage and bury him too. And then they'll have a happy undead family. And I did like, for the most part, the changes this movie made, because if they just did an exact remake, like what's even the point, And so for the most part, I actually did quite enjoy this movie. I thought the performances were solid. Even Ellie, and she is a child actor, so I do give her a bit more slack, but I thought for the most part she was good. We don't see quite as much of Jud. Like, he is a key character because in this version he and Ellie and Rachel see the pet cemetery, but Louis isn't even there because he's at work. But then Jud is the one who shows him the Micmac burial ground. However, after he takes him to that burial ground, he kind of tells him the history of it once Church comes back. But for the most part, it is Louis online Googling, and that is how he finds out a lot about the history. And we do not get the story of Tim Baterman, which I loved in the book. It was so creepy and disturbing, and I really wish they would have included that in this movie. But yeah, so Jud, he's still a key character, but it felt like he didn't get quite as much screen time as he'd had in the book in the 89 movie. But also, this movie does have Victor Pascow, and again, when he dies, he warns Louis about the pet cemetery, and then that night he shows up and he takes Louis to the pet cemetery, warns him to not cross the barrier. But at this point, Louis hadn't even been to the pet cemetery because he wasn't there when Jud was there with Ellie, and so he has no context for where the cemetery is. And I didn't understand why the movie did that, because sure, the audience has context, but the character of Louis, when Victor says that to him initially, he has no idea what he even means, And then we do have the Zelda storyline here too, and they do change it to where Rachel kind of does cause Zelda's death, like it's an accident, but it kind of is her fault. Whereas in the book and the other movie, Zelda had choked to death, and Rachel does try to save her, but she is unsuccessful. But yeah, the stuff with Zelda here were probably some of the creepiest moments. Yeah, it was so creepy, and I thought it was very well done. But speaking of creepy, there are so many jump scares in this, like so many semi-truck jump scares for one, but also, you know, like the cat popping out of somewhere, and just so many jump scares, way too many. And then again, like the 89 movie, this book doesn't quite convey the theme of grief quite as well as the book does, because the book just delves into it so much more. And honestly, this version feels like it just leans into the horror movie vibe more than anything. Although you could make the argument that Ellie being the one who chooses to bury people after her dad buried her, you could say it's making a commentary on like unhealthy family cycles we get trapped in generation after generation, repeating the same mistakes, you know? So maybe I'm reaching when I say that that could be an interpretation, but that could possibly be a deeper theme going on here with the movie. But before I wrap up, I want to talk about King's inspiration for this book, because in one of the later editions, he has a foreword where he talks about what inspired him to write this book. And he says how when his daughter was around 5 and his son was 2, they moved to a town in Maine that had this road where semi-trucks would drive by, and his daughter's cat was killed. And also in the hills beyond their house was a pet cemetery that children had created. And also the pet cemetery in real life, it was spelled wrong, hence the spelling of the title of this book. So yeah, so that was a real pet cemetery, and they buried her cat there. And then later that night, he hears her stomping on bubble wrap, and she is yelling like, "Why did God take my cat? Like, God can get his own cat if he wants one." Later on, his 2-year-old son is nearly hit by a semi-truck. And so this instance makes him think like, what if? You know, and the what if, along with the pet cemetery, is what caused him to think of this story. And King, he ends this note by talking about the line that Jud famously says to Lou, and we read, "I still find this book distressing and problematic, and particularly uneasy about the book's most resonant line spoken by Louis Cree's elderly neighbor, Jud. Sometimes, Louis, Jud says, dead is better. I hope with all my heart that that is not true, and yet within the nightmarish context of Pet Cemetery, it seems to be, and it may be okay. Perhaps sometimes dead is better is grief's last lesson. The one we get to when we finally tire of jumping up and down on the plastic blisters and crying out for God to get his own cat or his own child and leave ours alone. That lesson suggests that in the end, we can only find peace in our own human lives by accepting the will of the universe. That may sound like corny new age crap, but the alternative looks to me like a darkness too awful for such mortal creatures as us to bear." And then when it comes to book versus movie, so just to go into the grief theme again, I wanted to also mention how in the book, after Gage dies, we get this like vision Louis has of the life Gage would have led had he lived to be an adult. And then after, when he's in the process of digging Gage up and reburying him, he then has this fantasy of what life will be like once Gage returns from the dead. And he's like, me and Gage will go down to Florida. Rachel and Ellie will meet us there. I'll get a job being a doctor at Disney World, and just everything will be perfect. And so seeing these fantasies, these visions he has, again, it was just so gut-wrenching. And yeah, he just does such a great job at conveying this grief Louis feels, and how this grief, along with the burial ground, turns Louis insane. But it's interesting because Gage doesn't die until like 2/3 into the book, and he doesn't come back to life until like the last 20 pages of the book. And yet, even so, I was really enjoying this story, and I never felt like it went on too long until Louis digs up Gage, because in the movie, it seems like this goes very easily, but in the book, he did have a number of hiccups along the way. And just throughout his digging up Gage and going to rebury him and everything, like, we hear every little detail about this. I get it was supposed to be suspenseful, but it kind of went on too long, and I was just wanting him to get on with it. And it was just making me feel impatient. And then, yeah, with the 2 movies, like I said, I did like the 19 movie. I was tempted to not even watch it because I didn't hear good things, but I'm glad I did because I did enjoy it. And again, I liked the changes they made for the most part. But I will say, as messed up as the 19 movie ending is, I feel like there is something even more horrifying and tragic with the book ending and the 89 ending, with Louis just being so far gone and not learning his lesson and not caring about Ellie. What's going to happen to her, you know? And just rebearing Rachel. Like when that happened, I was just like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe Stephen King went there. And so while the movies, they do capture the creepiness. Having said that, like I said, Gage was not creepy looking enough, and Tim Baterman, he was creepy, but I felt like they could have done more with that. But for the most part, you know, both of these movies are very creepy. However, even though they try to delve into some of these deeper issues, neither of them do it quite as well as the book. And then the book also is probably scarier than both of the movies in some ways. Like, it's tough because visually things are often more disturbing to me when I see them. And yet at the same time, there were things in the book that, again, were just so disturbing and unsettling that we didn't get in the movies. And so the book is both able to be creepier and scarier while also having more depth to it, you know, and it packs even more of a punch, I would say. So when it comes to book versus movie, the book wins. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I do want to make a book recommendation for anyone who likes Pet Sematary. You should read The Fisherman by John Langan. I read this last year and I loved it. And now that I have read Pet Sematary, I can see how he was probably inspired by Pet Sematary in various ways because there are some similarities. It's not so similar that it feels derivative, like it feels like it is very much its own book. But yeah, I think if you like Pet Sematary, I think you will like The Fisherman. And then I will go ahead and link to Dr. Sleep on the Screen, which I covered a couple of years ago and I absolutely loved. And the reason I'm linking to that one is because that book also deals with death. And I love the way King writes about death in that book because, you know, King, he's a fantastic horror writer and he's very mainstream. And so maybe sometimes people can sell him short at times, but he has moments where his writing can just be so profound and beautiful. And so we just get some amazing passages, both in Pet Sematary, but also in Dr. Sleep. So yeah, that is the one I will link to in case you want to watch more Why the Book Wins Stephen King content. Go check that one out. And again, comment your thoughts down below on Pet Sematary. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.